So earlier this summer, I was speaking at a camp. I was speaking at a family camp, and this camp that I was speaking at, after they have chapel every day, they have a coffee hour where they just kind of put some treats out for different people, coffee, and it just gives the adults a chance to connect. Kids are off running, playing games in their program, and it gives the adults a chance to connect, build relationships, and maybe even process what they just heard. So I'm just sitting at a picnic table, and this guy walks up to the table. He sits down across from me, and he introduces himself, and he says, "You probably don't remember me, do you?" And I say, "No, sorry, I don't." And he tells me a little bit about himself and a little bit more, and it still doesn't register. And he's like, "Well, you maybe don't remember me, but you probably remember my son." And I was like, "Oh, tell me about your son." He said, "My son's name was Kevin, and he was here a couple years ago, and that was his last summer at camp, because when he was here, he had cancer." And when he said this, it all came back. In the story, he said, "You were our speaker that week." He rode around in a golf cart because he couldn't walk that well because he was months away from passing. We prayed for him at the end of camp. We brought him up and his family and surrounded him and prayed over him. People knew that he probably wasn't going to make it much longer, but didn't know how much time he had left. And the dad sitting across from me said camp was his favorite place. And that summer was his last summer here, and you were one of the few people near the end who got to pray over him and pray for him. And I was like, oh. It's just I knew when I met him and I knew when I prayed for him that it was probably near the end of the road, but just hearing all that again and being reminded of that, I was like, oh, I'm so sorry. And it was so sad. He was in his early 30s, a young family with 6 kids. He was like a bivocational pastor, a part-time youth pastor, part-time construction worker. And it was just like, oh, when you see all that, you're just like, oof. And so I said, so how were things, right? Tell me about life after your son being gone. And he said, that was hard, and that was awful, and that was difficult. But at least we knew what was coming. He said, afterwards, once he passed, we walked into this situation that completely caught us off guard. I was like, oh, what happened? He said, well, a few days after our son passed away, his wife jumped into a new relationship with somebody else, and then showed up to the funeral with that guy. And then a few weeks after, she moved all the kids in with that guy. I was like, oh, you've got to be kidding me. He's like, yeah. And then, a few months in, it's like these kids are reeling, they're grieving. Here's this new guy who's not their dad. And then the wife and this new guy started to get abusive and neglectful, and just their discipline tactics with the kids were not good. They ended up getting arrested for the way that they were treating the kids. And now the kids were divided amongst all of these extended family members. And this guy sitting across from me says, we have 3 of them. There's a couple who have 2 over here. There's 1 over here. And they are struggling to process all of this. And here we are 3 years from his passing, and we're still trying to sort out all the custody. And I was like, I am so sorry. And I asked him, how is it that you are navigating this situation? How in the world are you trying to work this out? What are you doing? And I wonder if you could answer that question as well. When you find yourself in the midst of an unexpected hardship, an unexpected challenge, when things don't go according to plan, what is it that you turn to that helps navigate through the difficulty? Because maybe you walked in here this morning and you're like, I'm in one of those seasons right now. I didn't see it coming. I didn't know it was on the horizon. A few weeks ago, this happened in my life, and now I'm reeling, trying to sort out how I make my way through this situation. Where do you turn? What do you look to? What anchors you when you are walking through an unexpected hardship? How would you answer that question? Maybe you're here this morning and you would be able to answer that question. Maybe you're here this morning and you're looking for an answer to that question. Well, fortunately for you, Acts 6 and 7 answers that question for us. And here's how our passage begins. This is Acts Chapter 6, starting in verse 1, we read, "In those days, the number of disciples was increasing." Now, the narrative arc of Acts 1 through 6 is continual and rapid growth. The book of Acts opens up with about 120 disciples. By the time we get to the end of chapter 2, there will be 3,000 added to that number. So if you're doing the math, that's 3,120 disciples. All convert in one day. By the time you cross into chapter 4, we're told that 2,000 more individuals come to faith and enter into the family of God. By the time you hit chapter 5, verse 14, it says more and more were added to their number. People are coming in so fast, so furious, the number is so high, we've lost count. We're just saying more and more people. And then you go to chapter 6, verse 1, and it says they were continuing to increase. By the time we get to the end of this section, verse 7 in chapter 6, it will say even a large number of priests became obedient to the faith. Some of the least likely people are starting to come into the family of God. So what that means is up to this point in the book of Acts, it's been all growth, all excitement, all momentum, all kinds of energy. And not just with increasing numbers, but also with miraculous healings. We're told in chapter 5 that people bring all of their lame, all of their sick to the apostles in hopes of healing. And some people are putting them close enough to Peter, hoping that his shadow would just pass over them because maybe his shadow is now even healing people. All growth, all excitement, all momentum. There's a few moments where the disciples are arrested and they're put on trial. They're questioned about what they're doing and why, but nothing comes of it, and they're released. And so with this increase in numbers, even though it's been really exciting, what we find in chapter 6 is that with the increase of numbers comes the increase of challenges, and we have our first internal conflict in the early church in chapter 6. This is what we read. "In those days when the number of disciples was increasing, the Hellenistic Jews among them complained against the Hebraic Jews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food." Now, in chapter 4, verse 32, we're told that no one in this early church claimed any possessions as their own. They shared everything that they had freely, even their food. And apparently, there was some collective food bank. People would bring food, put it at the apostles' feet, and then they, on a daily basis, would distribute that food to those who were in need. And the way that chapter 6 lays it out is that the church was divided basically into two groups of people. There were Greek-speaking Jews, and there was Hebraic or Aramaic-speaking Jews. Greek-speaking Jews might have been people who weren't ethnically Jewish, but converted to Judaism before making the decision to follow Jesus. And so the issue at hand is that the Hebraic-speaking Jews apparently, or widows rather, are getting more food than the Greek-speaking widows. My guess is this is an unintentional, unequal distribution of food. I mean, imagine if you're the apostles. You went from 120 disciples, and in a matter of, we don't know, weeks, maybe months, you went from 120 to well over 5,000, and all of these people are orbiting around you, and you're saying, we're going to live as one big family, and you have all of these administrative tasks that you now have to do. They will say their priority and their leadership of this group is teaching the scriptures and leading people in the practice of prayer. But yet they have all of these administrative tasks like distributing food to people in need. So what they do in verse 2 through 6 is they call deacons. They choose 7 individuals who will focus on the administrative tasks of leading this group of people so that they can focus on teaching the scriptures and leading people in the practice of prayer. And then this section ends in verse 7 this way. So the word of God spread, and the number of disciples in Jerusalem increased rapidly, and a large number of priests became obedient to the faith. So it appears that they were able to work through this conflict. They were able to sort it out, and this movement of people just keeps growing. Now, chapter 6, verse 7 is a significant verse in the overall scope of the book of Acts because it brings to end the first section of Acts, which you might be wondering, well, how do you know? Like, how do you know that's the end of the first section? Because there are no headings, there are no chapters. This is section 1, this is section 2. But there's thought to be 6 sections in the book of Acts, and this is the close of section 1. And the way that you know the sections of Acts come to a close is because the final verse in each of these sections ends with one of 2 or maybe even both of these things being said. One, you'll find at the end of each section it will say, the word of God continued to spread, and or the disciples were strengthened and increased in number. You find both of those things here. Sometimes at the end of each section, you find just one of those. Sometimes you find both of them. So that's one clue for us that this section is coming to an end. But there's another clue of how we know this section is coming to an end, and that is because when you cross into the second section of Acts, there's a shift in the emotional tone of the story. Again, up to this point, it's been excitement, it's been growth, it's been momentum, it's been healing, it's been seeing the kingdom of God advance in people's lives, and it's been mind-blowing. But the way this next section begins is a little bit different. This is what we read, chapter 6, verse 8. Now Stephen, a man full of God's grace and power, performed great wonders and signs among the people. So early in chapter 6, the disciples choose 7 deacons. Stephen is one of those deacons. And as we cross into the rest of chapter 6 into 7, the story revolves around Stephen. Verse 9. Opposition arose, however, from the members of the synagogue of the freedmen, as it was called, Jews from Cyrene and Alexandria, as well as the province of Cilicia and Asia, who began to argue with Stephen, but they could not stand up against the wisdom the Spirit gave him as he spoke. So one of the shifts in tone in the story now is growing opposition. Opposition has already been present, right? The apostles have been arrested and put on trial twice, but they're pretty much just minor threats thrown their way, questions that go their way, and then they're dismissed. But this time, this opposition is a little bit different and a little bit more intense. Verse 11. They secretly persuaded some men to say, we have heard Stephen speak blasphemous words against Moses and against God. So they stirred up the people and the elders and the teachers of the law. They seized Stephen and brought him before the Sanhedrin. They produced false witnesses who testified, this fellow never stops speaking against this holy place, which is probably a reference to the temple, and against the law. For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and change the customs Moses handed down to all of us. All who were sitting in the Sanhedrin looked intently at Stephen, and they saw his face was like that of an angel. Now, this might remind us of some of Jesus' trials in the Gospels, because when he was arrested and put on trial, we're told that false witnesses with false accusations come to Jesus and accuse him of things he didn't do. And just like in those trials, the high priest is there, the high priest is also here, and after those false accusations come against Jesus, the high priest asks Jesus, what do you have to say in response to that? And we see here the same is true. We're now into chapter 7, verse 1. It says, then the high priest asked Stephen, are these charges true? Now I want you to notice Stephen's response in this moment. Notice what he says to all of these false accusations and the high priest who's saying, hey, is this true? Verse 2. To this, he replied, brothers and fathers, listen to me. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham while he was still in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran. Leave your country and your people, God said, and go to the land I will show you. So he left the land of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. After the death of his father, God sent him to this land where you are living now. So what did you notice? What? He doesn't answer the question. Hey, are these accusations true? Let me tell you a story about a guy named Abraham. You guys know Abraham, right? Like, of course, he's not going to affirm these accusations, but you think at least he might refute them. He might bring his own evidence. He might show how they are false. He doesn't address it at all. He just starts telling a story. When unexpected hardship hits the first place, Stephen goes, specifically in his defense, but possibly in general, is he turns to a story, which might be something we do when hardship hits, whether we realize it or not. But the question is, when hardship hits, what story do you tell yourself? When hardship hits, what story do we end up telling ourselves? What story do we go to? If you've been around here for a while, you've probably heard me talk about, I've been a pastor almost 20 years, and some of the hardest years of being a pastor were the first 2 or 3. In that season, the church we were serving, I came in as a young 25-year-old hothead, thought I knew more than I did, and within a matter of a year, our church underwent a church split. People were angry with each other. We had all these contentious church meetings with people throwing accusations around, getting into fights. During that same time, we also experienced a miscarriage. And then shortly after the church split started to unfold, there were certain accusations coming my way that I was instrumental in causing the split, and it was a terrible season. And the thing I was telling myself, and the thing that I was telling God when we walked through that season was, Lord, I didn't sign up for this. This is not what I had in mind. Like before that, I had done camp ministry. I was a camp counselor. I had volunteered at a youth ministry. The majority of my ministry experience was playing games with teenagers and trying to get them to not eat too much pizza on a trip so they don't throw up in the van ride on the way home, right? And here I am walking through church splits, watching people throw accusations at me. And I'm like, God, I didn't sign up for this. This isn't fun. If this is what working for you is like, I might go get a new job, right? And there was one morning, I was out on a walk, and it was one of these weeks where like life was really hard. I'm not a guy who has a hard time getting up in the morning and getting going for the day. Like I get excited about each day. I'm like, what will today bring? I love what I do. I love to get after life. On that day, I couldn't get out of bed. And I was probably supposed to be in the office, 8:39, like it was 10 o'clock, and I was just moving. And the church was such a mess, nobody's calling. They're like, Brian, where are you? You should be here. And I just went and walked the neighborhood, and I started thinking about this place that I'm in, that's a hot mess of a situation. And I started thinking about all these other places I could have gone after I graduated seminary. I had an opportunity in D.C. that would have been put in front of me. There was an opportunity in Ohio that I could have pursued. There was even the church I grew up in New Hampshire was asking me to come work for them. I'm finding myself thinking of all of these other options, all of these things I could have done, but yet I chose this place, and here I am. And I found myself thinking, like, how can I get out of here? How in the world can I go do something different? The story that I was telling myself when hardship hits was one of escapism. Like, how do I get out of here as fast as I possibly can? God, in his severe mercy, held us there. We bought our first home at the very end of 2008, right before the market crashed. This all unfolded the first quarter of 2009. And our home value had dropped by like $70,000. And even if we wanted to sell, we couldn't. And so it was like God was saying to me, you want to leave, you want to run, but I'm going to have you walk through this. And I'm going to re-narrate hardship for you so that you turn to a different story when hardship comes, rather than thinking, I've got to get out of here as fast as I possibly can. When hardship hits, what story do you tell yourself? The story that you tell yourself in the midst of hardship will determine how you work through it. And what we see in this moment is that Stephen hits this unexpected hardship. He hits opposition. He's hauled into a trial, and he's told, hey, are these charges true? And the first thing that he does is he starts telling a story. He starts telling the story of the Old Testament. If you work through all of chapter 7, it's just one long speech by Stephen, basically telling the story of the Old Testament. Now, we're not going to read it all, we're not going to cover it all, but I want to highlight a few things about how he organizes this story and what he's doing with this story. And what he does is he organizes this story around 3 Old Testament figures, those 3 being Abraham, Joseph, and Moses. And what he's already told us in the first few verses of chapter 7 about Moses, or about Abraham, is that he was living in a town called, or an area of the world called Mesopotamia. You'll see on this map, that's this region, that big open region there, if we can put that up, Noah. He was living in a town called Ur, which is in the bottom right-hand corner of that map. God calls him to leave that town. He says, go to the place I will show you, and from there they leave Ur and they go to Haran. They live in Haran for a season until Abraham's father dies, and then from there they go to what is now modern-day Israel. However, at that time, it was not Israel. It was full of Canaanites. It was the land of the Canaanites. It was Canaan. And we're told that the intention of God bringing Abraham to that land was not to give him that land, but just show him that land. Verse 5. It says that he, being God, gave him, being Abraham, no inheritance here. It says if we go back to verse 4, after the death of his father, God sent him to this land where you are living now, but he gave him no inheritance here, not even enough ground to set his foot on. And if I'm Abraham, and I've left Ur, and I've moved to Haran, and then I've left Haran, and I've moved to here, and all of a sudden I'm a nomad, and you're not giving me any plot of land to settle. I'm asking God, why in the world did you bring me here? Like what am I supposed to do? I'm just a nomadic wanderer wandering the earth. I have no stake or claim here. But what you'll notice in the way that he organizes his story about each individual, when they hit some hardship, when they hit some difficulty, there is this 2-word phrase, but God, that speaks to God's intervention in the moment. God takes Abraham to this land. He shows him this land. I'm not giving you any of this land. Abraham could be thinking, why am I here? And then we read in verse 5, but God promised him that he and his descendants after him would possess that land. God's showing you, Abraham, I'm starting something new in this world. I'm starting with you, and your descendants will one day inherit this land. While it's already inherited by somebody else, it will one day be theirs. Now, there's a problem. If we know Abraham's story, there's a problem for Abraham at this moment, and that problem is, even though at that time Abraham had no child. Abraham has 0 kids. If we go back and read Abraham's story, he's 75 years old, which means he has tried for decades to have kids, and he has none. The book of Hebrews, when they record Abraham's story and they talk about this season of his life, they pretty much say Abraham was as good as dead. Sorry for those of you who are in your mid-70s. We don't view you that way, but maybe the Bible does. I don't know. But they were speaking to the reality that he was beyond the age of having kids. But here, God is promising him 2 things. One, I'm promising this land to your descendants, but the more immediate promise for Abraham is even though you have wanted kids and you've tried for kids and your wife is barren, you will, before you die, have a son. The immediate promise for Abraham is that he will one day have a son. He's 75 years old when he receives that promise. It takes almost another 25 years for that promise to come to fulfillment. But the emphasis of Abraham's story and the reason why Stephen is telling it is that God always, 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 always makes good on his promises. God is always faithful to his promises, and he has promised Abraham, I will give you this land through your descendants. You will have a son. Now from there, Stephen jumps from talking about Abraham to Joseph. Joseph, who is the great-grandson of Abraham. He's the youngest of one of the youngest of 12 boys, and he's a bit of an irritant to his older brother, sometimes as young siblings are. And part of the reason why they don't like this younger brother is because he's daddy's favorite. Now, most older kids always think the younger kids, oh, they're your favorite. You treat them bad. We don't hear that in our house. Actually, we hear that all the time in our house. They just assume you like the younger better than us. But in this case with Joseph, it was explicitly true. Dad showered him with gifts, treated him differently. The sons were off working the field, and he's home just hanging out with Dad. And it got to the point they were so fed up with him, they decided to sell him to slavery. Some random group of sojourners is passing by, and they say, this is our chance. We can offload this irritating younger brother to this caravan of people, and then we can be done with him. We can pretend that some wild animal killed him, and then off we go. He is out of our lives. We read that in verse 9. Because the patriarchs are considered the fathers of our faith. It's just a reference to Joseph's older brothers. Because they were jealous of Joseph, they sold him as a slave into Egypt. So he's picked up by this caravan. They drop him off in Egypt. And then shortly after being dropped off in Egypt, he's falsely accused of things he didn't do, and he's put into prison. I mean, talk about a whiplash change of an experience. Going from daddy's favorite, being showered with gifts, and now you're sitting in prison, and he's been there for 2 whole years. But again, God's intervention in his situation, in this story, is with that 2-word phrase, but God. Continuing on in verse 9. But God was with him and rescued him from all his troubles. He gave Joseph wisdom and enabled him to gain the goodwill of Pharaoh. Eventually, he is released. People realize these are false accusations. He rises to the ranks in Egypt. He's number 2 in all of the land, being Pharaoh's right-hand man. And then famine hits not just Egypt, but all of the area, all of the region. And because of Joseph's wisdom and forethought, he devises a system to stockpile food and then distribute food. And he saves countless lives, not only in Egypt, but also in Canaan, where his family lives. Because all of Canaan now is coming to Egypt to buy food. And through his story, he's eventually reunited with his brothers. And they think he's going to kill them because of what they did to him. But instead, he forgives them. And he brings all of his family to live in Egypt. And what he says to them at the end of his story is, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, so that a countless number of lives could be saved. The emphasis of Joseph's story is that God promises to rescue, redeem, and he brings good things out of hardship. When things get hard, it doesn't mean all of your problems will immediately go away, but God is working out good things in the midst of your difficulty. And then from there, Stephen goes to Moses. And the historical transition from Joseph to Moses is that a new Pharaoh comes into power, cares nothing for Joseph or his family, and actually enslaves them and forces them into brutal labor. Now, Moses' claim to fame is that eventually he grows up, he gets out on his own, he is called by God to redeem his people from slavery in Egypt, which he does. But then once they get outside of Egypt, once they are free, God's family starts to do 2 things. They grumble and complain. We wish we could go back to Egypt. You've brought us into this desert. We might as well have been brought out here to die. At least we had food and water in Egypt, Moses. They grumble and complain, and then they rebel. They start to worship false gods. And God's intervention in this moment is initially very different than in Abraham's and Joseph's story. Because when we come to the but God phrase in verse 42, we read, but God turned away from them and gave them over to the worship of the sun, moon, and stars. He's like, fine, I've just done all this for you. I've redeemed you, I've rescued you, I've saved you, and if you want to turn your back on me, fine, go ahead. But Moses pleads with the Lord. And he says, you can't. Your name is at stake here. You've just redeemed them from Egypt. And if the countries around hear that you've redeemed them and brought them out here to abandon them, your name and your reputation is mud. You have to stay the course. You have to make good on your promises because you always, 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 always make good on your promises. And God says, yes, I will. Now, from there, he gives Moses the law and he gives him instruction on how to build the tabernacle. The significance of the tabernacle is what? God's presence lives there. This is how God abides with his people. So in this narrative of the Old Testament, Stephen is showing how God promised Abraham, how God rescued Joseph, and how God was with his people. The emphasis being God is with his people even when they rebel. God is with his people even when they rebel. So the reality of hardship and what we see in this story is that sometimes hardship comes your way and it's completely out of your control. Sometimes hardship comes your way and it's stuff that just happens to you and you don't have any way to ward it off. Sometimes hardship comes your way because you have rebelled and turned your back on God. But even in the midst of any one of those three situations, God has promised to rescue and be with his people. So the question is, what story are we telling ourselves when hardship hits? Because the story you tell yourself in the midst of hardship will determine how you work through it. And what we see in this story is that God's story enables you to stay the course. When hardship hits, when it's unexpected opposition, when it's unexpected suffering, when it's something that you didn't choose, when hardship hits, God's story enables you to stay the course. Because God has promised his people that he will rescue them and his presence will be all enduring. Even when it feels like hardship is winning. Even when it feels like the suffering wins out. Because for in this moment with Stephen, it does. Like Stephen near the end of his speech brings a sharp accusation against his accuser, saying, you're accusing me of all these false things. The reality is you're turning your back on God. And they can't stand it, and they execute him on the spot, and they take his life. And it becomes this emotional turn in the book of Acts where things get real and things get hard. And what we see is that sometimes it will feel like suffering and hardship win out. I mean, go back to the story of the guy sitting across the picnic table from me who lost his son and now his grandkids are spread out to all these other families. I asked him, like, how in the world are you navigating this? How are you staying the course? And his response to me in that moment was, it's because of the story that you're telling, Brian. And he's not referring to like my stories and my illustrations or anything like that. He's referring to the story of God. It's like it's the story of God that anchors me. It's the story of God that reminds me of who he is and what he's doing in my life. And at the center of God's story is the person of Jesus. And what we see is that Jesus didn't run from hardship. Never. He walked into hardship because he knew he had a sustaining power through the love of God, the Spirit that abides within him, and the ultimate knowledge of what happens at the end. Because where this story ultimately ends isn't in hardship. It isn't in suffering. It isn't in pain. It isn't in death. Those things are realities in the here and now. But at the end of God's story, we see new creation. We see a renewed heaven and a renewed earth. We see those who have trusted in Jesus have been raised to new life. And we are with God in person for eternity. It's a story that grounds us in the midst of our hardship and says there's something greater, bigger, more powerful and stronger than the difficulty that I'm experiencing right now. So the question for us is, how do you navigate hardship? I would suggest it's probably through telling yourself a story. The question is, what story are you telling yourself? Is it one of, I got to get out of here? I've got to numb this so I don't feel this? Or is it a story of like, I can walk through this because I've been empowered by the God of the universe to withstand what I'm experiencing now, knowing He's working out all things for the good of those who love Him. And at the center of our story is the example of Jesus, who doesn't run from hardship, but walks into it. And so the way that we're going to finish our time together today is by going before the Lord's table. Because in this simple meal, we are reminded of the way that God shows His love so clearly to us by moving towards pain, suffering, and death for the sake of the world. That He is taking on our punishment from our rebellion and saying, I don't hold that against you. And that gives you the ability to say, I can work through difficult things. I can move towards hardship because Jesus did it. And He's in me and with me. And therefore, I know that I can handle this because there's a bigger story at play. It's this simple meal that reminds us of His blood poured out for us, His body ripped open for us, ultimately through His suffering so that we could experience the redemption of all things.